Ordu, Talchegu Parliament, Snahalapa Agus Blianava Ur. Welcome to the Scots Parliament. A good new year to all of you. The World University Debating Championship is held under British parliamentary rules, but since the reconvening of the Scots Parliament 18 months ago, after a recess of some 300 years, there is of course more than one parliament in the United Kingdom. This House works to the fundamental principles of accessibility, accountability, equality of opportunity and the sharing of power between the executive, the Parliament and the people of Scotland. The design of this chamber reflects that. We don't sit two swords' lengths apart, as do our colleagues at Westminster. This is a proportional parliament containing 6 parties and 1 independent, and our government, the executive, occupies normally the central benches. But for today, we go back in time to the Westminster model. For the purpose of this debate, to the right of the chair is the government, to the left, the opposition, and in the centre, representatives of some 300 teams from 40 countries and universities all around the world, who at the conclusion of the formal debate may catch my eye and speak for or against the motion while the adjudicators are conferring. This being an electronic parliament, this debate is also being broadcast live at this moment on the internet. Order, order. The question is that this House would make reparations for slavery. For the government, from Sydney B, Alex McCoon and Lelia Danilo, and from Monash B, Amanda Wilterson and Tim Sondreich. For the opposition, from the University of London Union B, Neil Harvey-Smith and Paul Gleeson, and from the University of London Union A, James Probert and Dara Grant. I now call on Alex McCoon to speak to and move the motion.
Speaker, sir, members of this House, this debate takes place in the context of moves towards to make reparations for the wrongs of the past. We've recently seen the German government apologise and make reparations for Holocaust victims and apologise for the sufferings of gay and lesbian people under the Nazi regime. We've recently seen the US government apologise to Japanese American citizens as well as African American citizens for the slavery they endured. We've seen the Pope apologise to Jews, women and minorities. And we have even seen, ladies and gentlemen, the British Parliament itself apologise for the colonial exploitation of Indigenous people throughout the Empire. However, where we see this debate today is in the recent moves to make responsible the Japanese government for the enslavement of women in the Asia-Pacific during World War II. We've seen that women, roughly 200,000 women from various Asian countries, including Korea and Indonesia and Malaysia, were enslaved as sex slaves by the Japanese government through government complicity throughout the course of World War II. And we've seen the continuing denial of this history of wrongs by the Japanese government itself. So what we're proposing is that the recent 4-day Women's International War Crimes Tribunal, which was held in Tokyo, that we endorse the judgments made there. We recognise that this tribunal, when held, did not have a legally binding decision, the capacity to make one. But we did recommend an apology to these women, a recognition of the wrongs that have been done to them in the past, and it did recognise an obligation to pay reparations, financial reparations for those wrongs, and we would endorse that. The tribunal itself was conducted under Judge Gabrielle MacDonald, an eminent lawyer, ladies and gentlemen, who was herself the head of the Yugoslavia War Crimes Tribunal, so has great credibility in these areas. And we saw the mock prosecution of members of the Japanese government at the time, including Emperor Hirohito and the War Cabinet, and they were found wanting. They were found wanting in the way they enslaved these women, and also the government's continuing failure to take responsibility. So we would order the Japanese government, firstly, to make an apology, to make a full recognition of the wrongs done to these women throughout that period, and secondly, to pay reparations. Now, because we recognise that many of these women, no thank you sir, for them the primary motive was an apology, it was recognition that wrong had been done to them. The model of reparations that we would impose is a community-based financial compensation, so that lump sums are paid to the communities from which these people were enslaved to benefit, to go towards health and education services to benefit women in those communities. Now, we realise that these communities have moved forward a great deal since the 1950s, ladies and gentlemen. I'll finish this first, no thank you. And we realise that any amount of financial compensation is not going to address the hideous wrongs that were done by enslaving women and forcing them into rape. However, we feel that financial compensation is necessary to adequately provide recognition of the wrongs that was done to these women and to provide some kind of substantive reparation, some substantive gestures to show that the Japanese government is in fact contrite and recognises the wrongs that have occurred. Yes, sir.
Can you tell us, under your model, who is exactly going to benefit from these reparations? Is it relations of these people? Is it communities in which they lived at the time? What's the basis of your
So
argument?
that's precisely what I've just outlined, but I'll go over it again once more for you. As I said, 200,000 women were taken from Asian communities throughout Southeast Asia, including Korea, Indonesia and Malaysia, among others, also Australians and Dutch women among them. What we would do is identify the communities from which they came, fairly easy given that we've got a list of 200,000 of them who are parties to this tribunal already, identify those communities and identify where that money will then go to address those services. No thank you sir. What I'm going to talk about is the benefits of this plan broadly and also the benefits for Japan if they do choose to recognise the wrongs of the past. And finally, how indeed it is justifiable to impose reparations for something that occurred 50 years in the past. My second speaker, Mr. Mello, will address the international context, talk about the movements of human rights law and the movements towards reparations generally and how they also require that the Japanese government make reparations in this instance. Ladies and gentlemen, what are the benefits for the proposal we have before the House today? Clearly, we're talking about horrific crimes here. Rape is now universally recognised as a war crime, and we're talking about rape on a horrific scale. We're talking about the forced enslavement of 200,000 women for periods of up to 10 years, extending after the end of the war, ladies and gentlemen. And so it's clear that there is a moral obligation to address the wrong and the crime that was done in that instance. Yes, sir.
Madam, we're not going to stand up here and defend mass rape. What we are going to do is ask you, what about the consequences politically within Japan with the rise of the Hawk movement and with the rise of the want for a military of their own? That isn't going to solve the problem, ladies and gentlemen, and all you're doing is giving them more ammunition.
So, as I said, I'm going to go on to address the benefits for Japan of offering reparations and an apology to these women later. But to flag them briefly, I think we can talk about the Japanese government's historical denial of the existence of these crimes and the benefits in terms of their own moving forward to a more moral stance, which they failed to capture at any point in the past to address those crimes. No, thank you. Okay, so we're talking about moving forwards into the future. It's not about addressing the past, but we realise that we cannot move forward until we recognise the wrongs that have occurred in the past. Secondly, for these women, it's important that they have a recognition and a voice and a stake in society. These women were disenfranchised in the most fundamental way, ladies and gentlemen. It is only right that we allow them the kind of recognition of what has been done to them, rather than the continuing denial that the Japanese government maintains. Thirdly, we recognise that it's important to force the powers that be to recognise their obligations to disenfranchise people generally and governments throughout the world. Okay, so the benefits for Japan. Japan, ladies and gentlemen, as you all know, has a history of denial. Their school textbooks failed to even mention the war in the Pacific until a couple of years ago. There's been a consistent failure to recognise or apologise to these women. Indeed, there's been a belittling of them, referring to them as prostitutes, whereas in fact they were victims of rape and victims of war crimes. Therefore, we believe that it's necessary for Japan's future development to recognise those crimes. We also believe that it's important that Japan show that it's capable of setting itself moral standards, that it's capable of constraining its own worst instincts and the worst elements in its own society that Mr. Grant's already referred to. It is the moral stance the Japanese government is required to take to say that these things will not be tolerated and that, to move forward in a morally constructive way and to aspire to some kind of more constructive future. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, it's justifiable to impose these reparations after 50 years because they were state-sanctioned. We're talking about the Emperor, we're talking about the War Cabinet, and we're talking about the current administration's ongoing failure to recognise those crimes, ladies and gentlemen. So because of the horrific nature of the crimes, because of government complicity in the past and now, and because of the benefits to be gained by an apology and reparations, we move that this House would require reparations of the Japanese government for the enslavement of women in the Pacific in World War II.
Apart from sound cues on the gavel, speakers will also have passing time on the digital clocks to the side of them. I now call on Neil Harvey Smith to open for the opposition.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen. You would think that as an English speaker in the Scottish Parliament, I would be unpopular enough were it not for the fact that I'm expected to stand up and defend slavery, Mr. Speaker. But nevertheless, that is the task that they've sought to burden me with today. And what we say is that while these crimes were truly horrific and were, in the modern context, certainly war crimes, we say that an apology is the right response and that compensation has huge difficulties and problems and implications that they simply haven't come up with their simplistic case. Now, what I'm going to talk to you about is some areas of precedent. I'm going to show you the holes in their case that they actually put by showing us why this wouldn't work in the first place and why it wasn't legally binding. I'm going to talk to you about law enforcement. I'm going to talk to you about whether Japan and the modern Japanese state can truly be held responsible for the actions of Hirohito and the dictatorship. And lastly, the political context of Japan today and what the implications and the consequences of this proposal would be for Japan and that area. So let's look at what she said. She said that it was right that the German government apologized for the Nazi regime and the harms caused. And we agree. And it was right that the US apologized for slavery. She also said it was right that the British should apologize for invading Australia, though I think she surely is more to blame for that than I am. My ancestors were drinking tea and eating scones, while hers were actually oppressing the Aborigines. But we'll leave that... But we'll leave that to one side for the moment, Mr. Speaker. And what we say is that, yes, while the Japanese did enslave the sex slaves during World War II, why is it that the Tokyo Tribunal, which suggested financial reparations, was not legally binding? It's because these reparations have no basis in international law. And I'm going to tell you why. Yes, I'll take you first, Speaker.
The reason they weren't legally binding was because the Japanese government, because of its continuing denial, failed to participate in any sense in this kind of fact-finding mission that the tribunal engaged in.
Oh, I see. So if the country doesn't take part, then therefore you can't find it guilty. I think that actually, just because you're absent, that is no basis upon which you cannot be found responsible for an action in any court in the world. Madam Speaker, I'm going to tell you the exact reasons why they can't be held responsible. And but first, let me look at the practicalities that you brought up. I'll take this in order. You said that this money would go for health and education for the communities in which they lived. And the reason that you've had to propose this is because you cannot prove who the women are who actually suffered in this way. So to give them, no thank you, so to give them any kind of individual compensation would be very, no thank you, would be very, very difficult, because you would have to prove entirely who all of they are, and therefore you're not prepared to stand up and do that. If you can define who they are, why aren't you giving the money to them? They are the people who suffered, not the communities in which they lived. No thank you. So why is it that you don't want to actually compensate the people who you say suffered, and instead you come up with this wishy-washy idea of compensating the communities that they live in? What good is that to the victims, Mr. Speaker? And how much is this going to cost? And why is it not going to open up the floodgates for other victims of other major crimes all around the world who would like compensation for all that they have suffered? But let me move on to the question of law enforcement, because what we say, Mr. Speaker, is that while rape is now recognised as a war crime, it wasn't then. And what we say is, how far back and how many instances in the world do you have to cover in order to be consistent? Because consistency is what is the basis of any international law. Let's remember that these were the days before the United Nations Convention of Human Rights. Now, that's not to say that we condone people breaking what are currently human rights. It's simply to say that we cannot impose this kind of historical relativism which says that people should be responsible for those days before them. And let's look at the question of responsibility, secondly, and ask, is the current Japanese government responsible? And let's remember that Japan, since World War II, has actually been, I'll take you in a second at the back, a democracy, one which can legitimately be said to be legitimate because it is elected according to the will of the Japanese people. Emperor Hirohito was a vicious dictator who was never elected by the people of Japan. And why should the current Japanese taxpayers be held responsible, Mr. Speaker, morally as they say, for the actions of one individual who ruled his country by force? We say that there is no moral responsibility for current Japanese people, most of whom were not alive, to pay reparations in this respect. I'll take you.
Sir, it was the current democratically elected Prime Minister Yoshiro Mori who caused outrage in Japan when he made comments about Japan still being a divine empire under the emperor and wanting to change public holidays back to reflecting the old holidays in favour of the emperors. This makes them legitimate. They're bringing back those old notions and they must be responsible for them.
I'm afraid that doesn't address the point. That doesn't address the point that I've just made, which is that the legitimacy is confirmed by the fact that he is elected. I don't have to associate or disassociate myself with those comments. He is the Prime Minister of Japan. That is a matter for the people of Japan, and he is therefore not responsible for the actions of Emperor Hirohito. I'm making a quite clear historical and political distinction between an elected government and an unelected government, and the responsibility that one can hold them therein. And let me move on to the political context that I said I would talk to you about. Because what we say on the opposition and the WUDC team, Mr. Speaker, is that this is very likely to cause a backlash in Japan. Why is Japan being singled out, they will ask, for having to pay reparations when none of the other countries involved in crimes in World War II have had to pay reparations, Mr. Speaker? What is it about Japan that means that they should be singled out? And would it not be clear, was that the bang? Thank you. Would it not be clear that a move to the right of the sort that Mr. Grant was talking about, when we've seen the breakup of the Japanese political stability that's been there since the war, with the Liberal Democratic Party losing power and the emergence of parties who are starting to talk in the ways that precisely that you were talking about, the current Prime Minister speaking, and the emergence of right-wing parties who are looking more proudly at their imperial past, we say that this opens the danger up of a backlash which would enable them to come to power, which would be an incredibly negative consequence for Japan. And then secondly, it's reopening old wounds in the region with those countries who will actually receive the compensation from Japan. Because what it would do would be to open their eyes again and to remind them once again of the past, of the cruel past of Southeast Asia. And what we say is that, combined with the move to the right, would be likely to lead to huge instability in Southeast Asia, because we would see that kind of resentment coming from memories of the past actions. So what we've seen, Mr. Speaker, today is a proposal that doesn't actually compensate the people who suffered from being kept in sex slavery. Therefore, it is not a very courageous proposal at all. They haven't told us even how they can prove exactly who the women are and why it is, if they can, that they shouldn't receive the money themselves. They want an apology. The women themselves said they wanted an apology. We would like Japan to grant them that apology, but we would not like Japan to be singled out ahead of all other nations as the only case in which they should have to go beyond that apology to give reparations. We say that it's wrong because they don't have any moral or political responsibility, because we have a democratic government versus a dictatorship, and the wider political context would lead to a backlash. Quite simply, Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to oppose.
Eyes on the clock. I now call the second speaker for the proposition, also from Sydney B, Lalia Dinello.
Mr. Speaker, sir, members of this House, what the key issues of this debate have been, it's been twofold. Firstly, the state's responsibility of Japan as a modern international citizen and its sort of global responsibility for the actions that were committed during World War II under its government sanction. And secondly, the sort of global principles involved in this debate in terms of the international principles of human rights and the fact that there were horrific wrongs committed which contravene every fundamental principle of international human rights and its protection. So those are the twofold issues of this debate. Firstly, what I'm going to get to is look at the nature of the tribunal and the sort of criticisms that have been levelled against it by WUDC and whether this sort of evidence gathering can actually lead to substantive reparation. Then I'm going to look at the sort of responsibilities of Japan as a modern state and the nature of governance there. Thirdly, I'm going to look at, and what Alex said I would look at, is the sort of broad movements towards the protection of international human rights and why this is a critical measure within that sort of broad context for those fundamental protections. So let's let's look at the criticisms that these guys levelled at the tribunal itself. And they wanted to criticise it for being non-legally binding. There's a difference between saying it was non-legally binding and the fact that the Japanese government wasn't found guilty. All the evidence pointed to the fact that it should have been found guilty. All of those 200,000 women did suffer horrific wrongs. All of the evidence said, if we can compel Japan to make substantive reparation, hell, we bloody well should, because the wrongs were so severe, because the wrongs they committed were of such a tragic and vile nature, and secondly, because they were state-sanctioned. And I'll get to that later. So for them to say that suddenly, because it was non-legally binding, that suddenly Japan wasn't guilty is a complete furphy. They're conflating the issues, Mr. Speaker, sir. Secondly, sit down. In terms of the evidence itself, it was very clear who the communities were, Mr. Speaker, sir, members of this House. The lawyer running the tribunal ran the Yugoslavian War Crimes Tribunal. Very, very familiar in terms of evidence gathering processes, knows the way international human rights and international war crimes law works. So what we'd say is, in terms of our community-based reparation, there is no problem identifying the communities. It's a question of compelling the Japanese government to make that sort of community-based reparation. So it's very, very clear we've got the institutional structures in place to make the Japanese government pay. Then we got this argument, and this was probably their most important one, so they said, in terms of the nature of Japan as a modern state and sort of the consequences for Japan if we make them pay reparation. We'd say this idea that you can't make a modern state liable for its past actions is a complete furphy. The idea of state continuity in terms of its legislative practices and in terms of its policy practices is well established in every tradition of law, Mr. Speaker, so members of this House. It's a fundamental principle of governance. That's how you make countries work, by saying governments flow on from the governments of the past, so you have some sort of principle of state continuity. So that's the first thing. In the same way that Tony Blair followed on from John Major, and there was an imperative for him to deal with the issues of the government, and there will be an imperative for future British governments to deal with issues like the Millennium Dome, we'd say the same thing applies to Japan, Mr. Speaker, sir. Sit down, members of this House. There is an imperative for Japan, if it wants to be considered a modern and responsible international state and international player, to deal with the issues of the past. I'll take you in a second. Then we got this idea that the fact that it was sort of 50 years suddenly meant, oh, well, state continuity breaks down. We'd say those wrongs are more than horrific enough to continue on after 50 years. Those communities are still suffering. There has been no historical acknowledgement of those wrongs. Japan can't move on until it recognises the reality, even if it's tragic in part, of its history. Neither can the communities move on if you don't recognise that having those women enslaved, having women raped and murdered, most of them were dead, that's why we can't pay it straight to them, having those communities economically and socially devastated, you cannot move on, and it's ridiculous to assert that a modern state cannot be held responsible. Yes.
Madam, your example of Tony Blair was lovely, but let's look at an applicable example like the example of Iraq. If Saddam Hussein's successor came in, would you hold him responsible for all the actions of the Saddam Hussein regime?
Of course I'd hold him responsible. The point is not whether we would, the point is to make them. Like, it's a question of whether they should be held responsible. I have no problem holding Saddam Hussein's successor responsible for the massacre of the Kurds. The German government recently made huge amounts of reparations to the women of Poland, Hungary and Eastern Europe in general for the rape and massacre of women in those Eastern European countries. So I have no problem whatsoever with holding modern states responsible for the atrocities of their past. Mr. Speaker, sir, members of this House. Finally, we got the backlash argument. And I love this argument that suddenly the rise of a couple of far-right movements suddenly means a modern state should be too scared to take on the tough issues. Suddenly should say, oh no, we've got a couple of people who might go, oops, that's a bad idea. Therefore, we shouldn't do the broadly responsible and morally responsible thing. It is ludicrous to suggest that the Japanese government, as a broad international state, cannot A, deal with the far-right movements, and two, should suddenly subvert its international and human rights responsibilities because of a couple of far-right movements within its nation. This is about broad principles of state responsibility. Mr. Speaker, sir, members of this House. Finally, what I'm going to look at now are the broad broad movements, where it's happened before, and why it is critical that it happen in this case. Now, we would say, firstly, these were not mere incidences of war, and we've said that before. These were very clear, horrific contraventions of human rights. It's not something that happened on the side of a war. These were very deliberate state-sanctioned programs of enforced slavery, enforced prostitution, and rape and massacre of specific communities, Mr. Speaker, so members of this House. Now, when you look at the broad human rights principles, it is very, very obvious that these contravene every basic principle governing the liberty and protection of the individual. So what we'd say is understanding that the right to the liberty and protection of an individual is a broadly acknowledged right. Reparation then becomes an entitlement, Mr. Speaker, so members of this House, for these communities and for these women. Because their basic rights have been contravened, it's not about saying it's up to the political vagaries of the Japanese government. It's about these people saying, we were so badly devastated, we have an entitlement to some sort of protection and some sort of responsible measure, acknowledging that and making substantive compensation for that. Finally, we get to why it is important that this is tied to some sort of economic measure. Now, we've seen the Canadian government extend sort of the treaty provisions and apologise to its Indigenous people. You've seen the Clinton government do it to the Nebraskan and Iowan Indians, and I've already talked about Germany. All of these were tied to economic measures because the communities suffered social and economic devastation. To allow them a substantive basis for continuing, you need to give them some sort of economic platform and service platform. So because of the international responsibilities and because of the stability offered, the Japanese government should pay reparation.
I now call the second speaker for the opposition from London Union B, Paul Gleeson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the Glasgow World Debating Championships, ladies and gentlemen of the Edinburgh Parliament. We come to you with infection. As an Irishman, ladies and gentlemen, can I say, firstly, it's an honour to be speaking here. And can I say, secondly, that once you finally get one of these of your own, life becomes a whole lot better. As my partner, Mr. Harvey Smith, pointed out in his speech, ladies and gentlemen, we are not going to get up here and counter the allegations of the atrocities which were committed. Because, ladies and gentlemen, they're more than allegations. They're true. They happened, ladies and gentlemen. And we concede that on this side of the House. And we're not going to get up here, ladies and gentlemen, and claim that those people didn't suffer, as these people are kind of implying us to do by spending minutes and minutes talking about it. What we're saying is they're dealing with a specific principle that they outlined in their speech, that reparations must be paid to whom, ladies and gentlemen? To the communities from which they came at the time. And that is what we're prepared to tackle head on. Because, ladies and gentlemen, as Mr. Harvey Smith outlined, there are crucial issues in this debate regarding who exactly was responsible, ladies and gentlemen, and who exactly should benefit from this compensation as outlined. We've told you how this will open the floodgates, ladies and gentlemen. We've asked about enforcement, and we told you about the political context of Japan today. What we are saying to this side of the House, ladies and gentlemen, is that they must show far greater reason on this side of the House why the very people who suffered in the past should result, ladies and gentlemen, in greater compensation for certain communities from which they came then. And we believe that that burden of proof has not been shown by the proposition. No thank you, sirs, because I want to deal firstly with the arguments as outlined by the Sydney team in first proposition. And their basic case that we're opposing here is that lump sums must be paid to benefit the communities from which, ladies and gentlemen, these victims suffered, or from which these victims came. And we say this is wrong, both in terms of principle and in terms of practice. And we say, firstly, on the point of principle, and don't let this sound too controversial, ladies and gentlemen, these communities are no more deserving of compensation now, of better health now, or of better education facilities now, than other communities within Japan today, and within Southeast Asia. And we say that, ladies and gentlemen, because we believe that you must base your spending and base the facilities you provide on the need which exists today, rather than the wrongs which were done to people from that region in the past. And if, ladies and gentlemen, there's a fundamental correlation between the communities which suffered then and communities which are continuing to suffer today, then we say absolutely, you are right to put the monies into these areas. But what they have outlined in the First Sydney team is that these areas should get the money regardless, simply because that was where the victims came from in the past. That, as a principle, ladies and gentlemen, we oppose. And I'll deal with the Sydney team on that point.
Okay. The evidentiary processes at the Tokyo Tribunal said economic devastation. That meant the adult women population was gone and the women children were sent into forced prostitution. So it's very clear the communities are suffered and are still suffering.
It is very clear that the communities have suffered. Absolutely no argument from this side of the House. What we are saying is that the scale of the suffering in the past should not be the basis on which you plough money into the regions today. What must be that basis, ladies and gentlemen, is how much they deserve it in today's world, ladies and gentlemen, and the context of modern Japan. No, thank you. And we said, secondly, on that point, in terms of practice, this will have to open the floodgates, ladies and gentlemen, throughout Southeast Asia for all those who suffered in all communities in the past. Because if you apply their principle, ladies and gentlemen, and anyone who suffered must be as deserving under their principle, then that is quite simply what you do in this territory, ladies and gentlemen. And we are saying on this side of the House that, again, the same principle, ladies and gentlemen, because these people haven't sought out the victims or the relatives of the victims, but the communities from which they came. And if you apply that principle further, ladies and gentlemen, beside the one of paying for the past, ladies and gentlemen, then it becomes not only a very costly principle to undergo, but a wrong one in terms of resources. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, when they talk to us about the scale of atrocities here, what we are saying is that we are not denying them on this side of the House. And that is a fundamental precept of our argument. No, thank you. The next major point brought up by the Sydney team was this idea of state culpability, ladies and gentlemen. We say, if you merely take state culpability as being country culpability, as in Japan did this before, Japan must pay now, is a very different thing from the state itself, ladies and gentlemen. Because the state was entirely different. For one, it was a dictatorship, ladies and gentlemen. And how are you going to make democratic Japan pay, ladies and gentlemen, for the crimes which are committed under a regime at a different period in their history? If you look through history, ladies and gentlemen, at how Weimar Germany was crippled after World War I, and the very massive reparation that that country had to pay at the time, ladies and gentlemen. And what was wrong with that? We're saying it's the principle which was wrong. It's the principle that a country can make a fresh start. And that principle applies to Japan now as it should have applied to Weimar Germany then. And ladies and gentlemen, while we will concede that the consequences in Japan now might not be so drastic as were in Weimar Germany, it is the principle which must hold true, ladies and gentlemen, because Weimar Germany fell down on the principle as well as on the practice. And when they get up here and say that their analogy is this one, ladies and gentlemen, of Tony Blair and John Major, what we will say, ladies and gentlemen, firstly, no one should be responsible for John Major. And secondly, ladies and gentlemen, you must make the differentiation between a continuation of democracy, ladies and gentlemen, and the difference between the states. I'll take yourself from Monash, sir.
Sir, it's been well recognised that the status of women in Japan is, let's just say, not quite equal. How are you going to go about dealing with those issues that are responsible from the war and current situation?
How we go about dealing with these issues. Dealing with the status of women in Japan right across Japan, regardless of the region from which they came, regardless of the community from which they came, ladies and gentlemen, because that is where we believe the case is flawed. If they're getting up here and saying the status of women must be improved, we can agree with that point, ladies and gentlemen. What we will not agree is its targeting in specific areas. And we must remember, in talking about state culpability, we must also talk about individual culpability. Because we're saying that the young Japanese people who pay for this, ladies and gentlemen, are no more culpable than me and Mr. Harvey Smith, ladies and gentlemen, for the crimes which were committed by those in the past. And ladies and gentlemen, if we're talking about individual culpability, then we must move on to that point as well, ladies and gentlemen. If they talk to us about movement to protect human rights, where we say, ladies and gentlemen, on our argument on this side of the House, is that the movement to protect human rights must consist of recognising this in the past, and we have admitted, ladies and gentlemen, and gone along with the call for an apology. What we are saying, ladies and gentlemen, is accepting that is a very different thing to paying compensation for all the wrongs which were committed then, and we must recognise the scale, ladies and gentlemen, and the widespread nature of those, and if you adopt the principle of compensation, how you will be opening the floodgates in this regard, ladies and gentlemen. If they talk to us about responsibility, ladies and gentlemen, and they did, if you take even a far more recent example and a far more pertinent case, that of Kostanica in Yugoslavia now, ladies and gentlemen, we agree he must repair, ladies and gentlemen, and spend the money, but he must do it where it is needed, ladies and gentlemen, and not in the areas which suffered most, ladies and gentlemen. And we say that there might be a large correlation, but what we're saying on the side of the House is that need must be the basis of all arguments. We've talked to you about responsibility, we've talked to you about enforcement and the context of Japan today, ladies and gentlemen. And let us say this on this side of the House. We are not against the atrocities they talked about for minutes upon minutes. What we are against, ladies and gentlemen, is the kind of compensation as outlined by this team.
I now call the third speaker for the proposition from Monash B, Amanda Wolfthausen.
Ladies and gentlemen, the first half of this debate has been very focused on looking at the responsibilities that the Japanese government owes for atrocities done in the past. What Monash is going to bring to this debate is look at the responsibilities that the Japanese government has today, and the sort of benefits we see from paying these reparations are going to have in two ways. Firstly, allowing a nation like Japan to begin to deal with the atrocities it committed in the past, but secondly, and was brought up by Tim in his point of information, and that is the fact that the sort of things which went on in the past have led to massive social inequalities for women in Japan and within the region, ladies and gentlemen, because what they've ignored on this side of the house is that women were taken from all over the region, from places like Korea, from places like Indonesia, and that by raising the profile of the plight of women during war will actually lead to some sort of recognition of women within these communities. And it was brought up in a point of information which very badly dealt with from that side of the house, was brought up that what we saw going on when you saw the Japanese comfort women, what actually was happening was the removal of women, no thank you, the removal of women from these communities. And what we're talking about here is communities which don't necessarily reflect the kind of Western cultures they're talking about. We're talking about communities, ladies and gentlemen, from places like Indonesia, from places like Korea, which felt the loss of the women folk from their communities very badly, ladies and gentlemen. That is why we want to see the monies going to these communities, to start to pay the communities who also suffered as a result of this loss. And besides the fact that these women themselves have got up there and said, we're prepared to accept an apology, what we want, we're not wanting the money for ourselves, we want recognition for the plight of ourselves, but also of our families and of the communities we left behind. I'll take you.
Madam, so basically what you're trying to tell me is forcing the patriarchal society of Japan to pay money out to women within minorities is somehow going to increase their love for women within these minorities. I don't think that's the causation, madam, and I think what you're doing is actually harming the situation. That point of information
is the very point we're trying to make. This idea that forcing the patriarchal society is the wrong way to go about it. What we say is that forcing the patriarchal society is very much the right way to go about it. It's about telling them that you committed wrongs in the past and you're not going to get away with it anymore, ladies and gentlemen, that you are actually going to be held responsible. So what I'm going to note, both of you sit down, so what I'm going to look at in my speech is firstly, let's clear up what the context of this debate is when we're talking about a nation like Japan, and then secondly, take this further and take a look about how something like the Japanese comfort women, something like a case like this, and treating it with the dignity and respect it deserves and paying the reparations they deserve will actually increase the profile of the plight of women during war. So what we've got up here instead is that, we have the situation with Japan at the moment is very much a situation of denial, and no one seems to be disagreeing that at this point. But what we say, and Tim asked it in a point of information, is when we have the current Prime Minister starting to talk about what went on in the past, starting to bring up the empire, ladies and gentlemen, and starting to actually generate some sort of public discussion on the matter, we see Japan at a crossroads. And what we say is that Japan needs to take the initiative at this stage with a case like the Japanese comfort women and actually say, we're prepared to deal with our past, we're prepared to move forward. Not only for the sake of bringing some closure to what went on in the past, to stop just talking about the great Japanese empire and ignoring all the bad things that went along with it, ladies and gentlemen, but also we see that this is going to have flow-on benefits for the social structure as it stands at the moment. No, both of you sit down. But firstly, let's just take a quick look at what we had from the opposition. Now, what we say is that they've got up here and said, well, we're not going to be able to pay these communities. That's the wrong way about doing it. We don't think it's fair that the taxes of the individual Japanese should go to these communities. Well, I've already dealt with the fact that the communities deserve this money, and the women who brought this case to the tribunal actually outlined that when they first took it there. But what we would say is that not only is this the case, but what we would say is that paying money, ladies and gentlemen, yes, it is complicated. It can be difficult. But we saw with the Nazi slave labour camps that it was done. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, some people may miss out, but we think that's not a good enough reason from that side of the house not to bother trying at all. So what we'd like to say, though, both of you sit down, so the first thing I'd like to take a look at is this idea that at the moment there is tension in Japan, and that there are two issues. Firstly, how do we best respond to this tension? And secondly, who responds? And what we've got up here instead is that, yes, there are right-wing political parties in Japan. There are parties who want to rearm and want to return Japan to its glorious past. And it's for this very reason, ladies and gentlemen, that the Japanese government needs to take a stand and say, no, the past wasn't so damn glorious after all. The past, ladies and gentlemen, is not something we want to revisit. No, sit down. And what we say, and we've seen now the first government got up here, and I've already just explained to the opposition how it's important it's important for there to be state continuity and for state to recognise this. What we would say is that for the sake of the Japanese population as a whole, that we need to bring it back, ladies and gentlemen. The Japanese population need to be reminded of their past and need to be held accountable of it. And for the reason, ladies and gentlemen, which we're bringing to this debate, is that they have very entrenched social problems from their past. Things like the unequal status of women, things like problems with their past. I know both of you sit down. And so what I'm going to look at in my speech is the way that what we see, and what was very much ignored in the first half of this debate, is when we're talking about the Japanese comfort women, we're talking about a test case for the plight of women during war, ladies and gentlemen, something which has been ignored thus far. And what we say is that when we're looking at things like the International Criminal Tribunals, the international human rights law is limping towards proper recognition of the plight of women, proper recognition of things like rape as a war crime, ladies and gentlemen, something which we see as something which deserves the recognition that comes from paying reparations, treating it with some sort of seriousness. I'll take you, sir.
Me? Thanks. Tell me one thing about your new argument. How is giving this money to women who suffered in the past going to help prevent the discrimination that happens in the Japanese education system, in the Japanese workplace, and do anything to change the situation of women in modern Japan?
We're not saying that this is the panacea, ladies and gentlemen. Obviously it's not. We're not saying that these two things are mutually exclusive. What we're saying is that the sort of high-profile recognition of what went on in the past, of what the Japanese government was quite happy to do to women in the past, is the sort of thing which is going to bring the sort of issues which they're very worried about on that side of the house to the forefront. It's the sort of thing which is going to make these issues important and recognise the role of women within these communities as something which is valuable, as something which needs to be recognised as something which is violated. So what we've seen so far in this debate is an opposition who are very scared of paying money, ladies and gentlemen, because they don't think, that every Japanese person should be held responsible. We think this was very well dealt with in the first half of this debate. The first half of this debate dealt with issues of state continuity. What we've got up here and what we want to see discussed in the second half of this debate is what the best way for Japan to come to terms with what went on in the past and what it's actually meant for the state of the Japanese social structure at the moment, and how this will actually lead on to flow-on benefits for the recognition of women as having been abused during war and as being something which needs to be recognised as being valuable and something which needs to be repaired. For that reason, ladies and gentlemen, the motion must stand.
And I call the third speaker for the opposition from London Union A, James Probart.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker, members of the House. I was challenged by the last speaker on the proposition, ladies and gentlemen, to stand up here and tell you how best Japan could be made to realise the wrongs that have been done in the past, how best it could come to terms with the actions of past Japanese soldiers during war. Well, I'm going to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that certainly it's not through the first proposition's case, which was cleverly brushed over by the second proposition, because they seem to ignore the fact that we're talking about forcing Japan through tribunals and international law into doing something it does not want to do. And that's going to be the key of my case, ladies and gentlemen, the effect of forcing an apology out of Japan. First of all, I'm going to show you how there is no principle under international law to force Japan to make these payments, and I'm going to show you how Germany is a completely different case. Secondly, I'm going to say, having proved that there is no principle, is the practice, is the benefit ensuing from these payments so great that we should make this a special case, as Germany did in Europe, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm going to show you that that isn't true either, because as we heard from the mouths of the proposition themselves, this is not going to work in practice and will not actually benefit the people who suffered. And thirdly and fourthly, I'm going to look at the consequences. Thirdly, I'm going to look at the consequences in Japan. As she herself said at the last speaker on the proposition, the consequences for the social structure and the political situation in Japan itself. And finally, I'm going to look, as I said I would at the beginning of my speech, at the effect of forcing an apology, at what this really means about how we treat the past, how we look at wrongs done in the past. No, thank you, madam. Sit down. First of all, what do we mean by international law and how this principle simply isn't true, ladies and gentlemen? Well, we heard from the first speakers on the opposition that there is no international law saying that a state, because of continuity in perhaps its name, but we didn't hear much more about the continuity of Japan because, of course, now it's a democracy. That just because there's a continuity in its name, no, thank you, madam, we should make it responsible for crimes that are now recognised as crimes, but of course weren't then. So, although I practically accept that this is an horrific thing to have done, and I'm not saying that it is not a bad thing. If you're going to bring up a legal point, madam, then you have to substantiate it with legal fact. And although practically you may be right, don't you accept that legally you're wrong, madam?
Japan is still an infra-led democracy. It was an infra-led state then. There is enough institutional continuity to hold Japan responsible now.
Yes, well, all right then, ladies and gentlemen. Britain has been a monarchy now for goodness knows how many centuries, and presumably we're responsible for every invasion and every war that we've fought, and every action that we've taken in Ireland, for example, ladies and gentlemen. Well, obviously, although many great wrongs were done, ladies and gentlemen, and although I'd love to make amends, nobody practically suggests that things that happened centuries ago, no thank you, should be atoned for by countries. We do give countries a second chance when they change the way they run. We give Russia a second chance, and we don't blame it for the sins of the Soviet Union. And you, although you self said you would make, no thank you, the successor of any dictator in, say, Iraq, responsible for his crimes, we would say that would be a disaster, and that would be going against everything that we've said to the people of Iraq, that we're not fighting them, we're fighting their current ruler, ladies and gentlemen. No thank you. The difference with Germany is that Germany chose to make these payments, ladies and gentlemen. The Germans recognized themselves that what had been done during the Second World War by the Germans was wrong, and therefore they said, it is for our own good and the good of those around us that we recognize now that we've done wrong and we want to make amends for it. They didn't say, we are guilty for the sins of our fathers. We said wrong has been done here and amends should be made for this wrong, although we will remember this sin. You're not making Japan, sorry, you are making Japan pay this. You're not letting Japan get into a situation where it itself can accept the wrongs and voluntarily say, now we must make amends for it. And that's a disaster, ladies and gentlemen. And so that is why there is no principal point that you can under law force a country to pay. No, thank you, madam. Can we, in practice, say that this is worthwhile bending a principle in order to mend the wrongs done in these communities? Well, no. We heard from the proposition themselves that this isn't going to work. Not only will it not work because they've said, well, we have to pay money to communities in, say, Korea. I'd like to see how you're going to get the money to communities in North Korea, ladies and gentlemen, if it's going to do them any good. No, thank you. I'd like to see if it's worthwhile giving money to communities in Australia that you mentioned, which don't have great problems with health and education, and aren't, I would argue, suffering these problems. No, they are very well-educated people, I'm sure. No, thank you. No, thank you. You can prove that in your speech, sir. So we've heard that it isn't going to be practical because it doesn't help the people who suffered. We've heard by those two examples, and the same applies in shades throughout the region, how it isn't really going to help the communities, how it isn't going to undo the wrong, how it isn't going to make right the wrongs that were done. So practically, it's a failure. Principally, it has no principle, and practically, it's a failure. No, thank you. And so both those grounds would be your argument for. But let's look at the consequences now, because although we accept it might be nice for an apology to be made, and although we think that these things are wrong and we wish that people would apologize for them, no thank you, what are the bad consequences of you making Japan take these actions, ladies and gentlemen? First of all, we've already heard from all the speakers on this side of the House about the spectre of the right rising in Japan again, about people who glorify the military exploits of the Second World War, about people who do believe that the emperor still has an important role to play in Japanese society. Now, at the moment he doesn't. He is a figurehead. Japan is a democracy. It is a sensible, stable country that does help out nations in the region, that has helped them economically and politically, and is an important force for good. But by making Japan run to the right wing, no thank you, by making Japan embrace the ideas that you already yourself have admitted are beginning to surface in some sectors of Japanese society, but happily not many, by forcing them into the arms of these people, you're simply undermining the Japanese position for good in the region. You're destabilizing relations with Korea and with China and with Taiwan. You're making every practical modern situation worse. And, you know, it's shocking, ladies and gentlemen, but I'm happy to say on this side of the House that I believe the modern world is more important than the past. However horrific these crimes are, I believe that we have to make peace and security in the modern world our priority, not the past, ladies and gentlemen. No, thank you. And finally, beyond this destabilizing effect, and beyond this destabilizing effect both in Japan and in the region, what is the effect of forcing an apology? Well, not only is it tokenistic and means nothing, I would go so far as to say offensive to the people who receive it, because they know it's grudgingly given through the teeth of the Japanese government, and they don't actually want to apologize. It's nothing more than an ineffective sop, making the Japanese and making us feel better, as if to say, well, that's all in the past, we've said sorry, we don't need to worry about it now, you have no claims, we've given you some money, we've bought you off, we've bought away your crimes, we paid for our wrongs, and now we don't have to stand by them. Now we don't have to say they were wrong, because we've done something about it. Well, this is not the way you deal with the past. You don't look in history books and say, how can we make this history book make us feel less guilty by paying money to those who suffered? You accept your history as it is. You learn from your history so that in the present you don't make the same mistakes. You are making those same mistakes. You are driving Japan to militarism. You are destabilizing the region. You are offending the sufferers. You're not learning from the mistakes of the past, ladies and gentlemen. You're just making tokenistic paternalistic gestures to allay the guilt of people who have not yet recognised that an apology needs to be made. We say Japan will realise that this wrong has to be done. We hope it realises that. But you're not allowing them to make that apology a meaningful one. And you're not putting into place a regime which is going to make any practical benefit to the people who suffered from those crimes. You have no principle, you have no practice, and you're leaving yourself wide open to the most abhorrent consequences. It's for these reasons that I beg to oppose this motion.
And I call the closing speaker for the proposition from Monash be Tim Sonreich.
Thank you, Mr. Speakers, members of this House. And what was very amusing for the previous speaker to stand up here and say, well, what Japan shouldn't do is look in its history books for solutions to its problems. And we think that's pretty good because in their history books, there's very little mention of what we're talking about here. And when it is mentioned, they still use terms like comfort women. Instead of just saying what they were sex slaves. So what they want you to do is say, well, what Japan should do is just accept its past that nobody talks about and somehow move on even though no one's talking about it. And then later on down the track, hopefully when not everybody vaguely associated is dead, then we'll be able to make some sort of decision about helping those women and about helping the plight of women in Japan. And they told us we had no practical solution, ladies and gentlemen. What does this debate come down to? Well, first of all, what I want to discuss is the context this debate was held in. And secondly, I want to move on to the issue of how to deal with the problems that are identified by that context. And finally, in direct response to my previous speaker, the effects of forced reparations. No, thank you, I'm still making fun of you, sit down. The context of this debate, and the question we need to ask, is what is the problem facing Japan and the women in question? And those are twofold. One, Japan still continues, or the Japanese people and their leaders, still continue to deny the crimes against humanity, and more importantly, the crimes against women themselves were committed by their government, and that denial perpetuates those crimes even today, despite 50 years having gone by. No, thank you. Secondly, the lack of equality for Japanese women is directly in proportional response to the sort of situation we've seen at the end of World War II, where the issues of women being treated as sex slaves, the issues of women being treated, no thank you, as a commodity were never dealt with, and they wonder why there's a massive glass ceiling in Japan and why there's incredible inequality for women in Japan. They say, well, as long as they wait long enough, they'll figure it out because they're a good democracy and they trade with Taiwan. Sit down, sir. So when we ask ourselves how to deal with these questions that have been raised, we have two propositions. The one from the government is to force the Japanese government to pay reparations and make an apology. Now sure, they probably don't want to do this. Not many governments want to hand over half their GDP in 1 year to pay back for crimes they've committed. We accept that that's probably true, but we don't care, ladies and gentlemen, because it's right, and they can't pretend that it's not. I'll take you at the front, sir.
Yes. Do you think that half the GDP should go to women and improving women's equality, regardless of the region from which they came, or you think that half of the GDP should go specifically to the regions which were damaged during that period?
Look, what he's going to stand here and say is, let's have a look at the Nazi labour camps where people were paid back, and some of those people couldn't prove they were in those Nazi labour camps, and a few unfortunate people, and we think this is disgusting but a fact, missed out. We think that's horrible but unfortunate because the benefit given to those people who were repaid and could be identified, whether they were Japanese or whether they were from outlying islands, those people deserve those reparations, and if we can prove it, then we should give it to them. And if it's half the GDP or all of it, we don't particularly care particularly much. Sit down, sir. Because what they've told us here is, well, we admit that there are problems with women in Japan, and the way to deal with it is just to have an apology. They tell us the Japanese government doesn't want to deal with issues of women, doesn't want to pay for the crimes they've committed and shouldn't be forced, but that somehow this apology will materialise out of the ether because they're a good democracy and because they're a good economy and they trade with their neighbours. We think that's facile. So the next question is, are they responsible and hence should they be forced? And what we've told you in this debate is the Japanese people, and this continues on today, benefited from having those sex slaves. I'm going to stop calling them comfort women because it's offensive to this side of the house. Sit down, sir. You bother me too. When the Japanese people benefited directly from having these women, using them, paying them nothing, destroying the economies around them that they now apparently help out, so that makes it all right, That's unacceptable, and that benefit that's still being felt today in a very highly industrialised and a high standard of living first world nation, then that benefit transfers legitimacy onto these claims. The second issue here is that the Japanese people continue to deny and to no longer and to not ever be educated about those issues. They know those issues are there because when Yoshiro Mori stands up and says Japan's still a divine country under the emperor, the people freak out knowing that their trading neighbours will stress and that they don't want to deal with the guilt that they know is underlying their situation. They know it's there, even if it's not in the textbooks they'd like us to read. They just don't want to deal with it. We say, sorry, you have to, you're responsible. Sit down. Now, they've asked us how this is going to bring home benefits to the Japanese women, because if most of this money does go to women from other islands, and even if it is just a symbolic tokenistic gesture, which we reject, then how will it help those women in Japan? Well, we say what the feminist movement in the first and third world has always needed is a watershed moment. It's something that may not necessarily put money in the hands of every Japanese woman or break the glass ceiling above every one of them, but makes a symbolic move to the next generation of Japanese that the rights of women must be taken seriously and that equality is not something you can talk about, but something you have to enforce. No, thank you, sit down. So if this is not the first step towards breaking down the stereotypes in Japan, then their motions of some vague apology certainly aren't. Yes, sir, go.
Well, as it's your last point of the competition, answer me this. Exactly how does giving money to people in South Korea, how is that likely to help people in Japan break down the barriers that exist in education and in the workplace?
Sit down, so you're making fun of my last point. What we've told you just before is that what you need is a watershed moment. That women all around the world were aided by the fact that American women won the vote. Even if they didn't, for many years on, that critical watershed moment that changed the fundamental thinking of people in that nation and in others meant that those women all around the world benefited, and it led to a stream of nations taking on those rights afterwards. So it doesn't matter whether it's a Japanese or a Korean, the incentives and the message are there. The final issue we have to look at here is the effect of forced reparations. Because what we've told you here is that the rights of women must be taken as paramount in this debate. And it doesn't matter if they think that it's going to be costly or difficult, and it doesn't matter that they think the German public are a different situation. We think it does matter. Because the fundamental difference between Germany and Japan is that Germany was forced to deal with what they did in World War II because their leaders were put on trial or committed suicide. The Japanese leadership managed to get off because the divine emperor was allowed to just go into hiding, and as long as he didn't mention the fact that he'd butchered a few million Chinese, no one would say anything about it. That's why the Japanese people haven't been forced to deal with their crimes as the German people have, and until some watershed moment makes them change, they'll never follow the path of the German people, which have led to some kind of change. So what have we told you in this debate? We've told you that it's not enough to play semantics with how much and who gets what. That the morality overrides the problems of does every single person get a benefit. And we finally, what this half of the debate have brought to the debate, is that it's not just about crimes against humanity, it's not just about World War II, it's about the current women in Japan and the current women in Southeast Asia who deserve to be seen as equal and deserve to have those crimes recognised, and we beg to propose.
And finally, the closing speaker for the opposition from London Union, A. Darragh Grant.
Mr. Speaker, sir, ladies and gentlemen, equally as an Irishman, I'm particularly happy to be standing in this great chamber. Unfortunately, I've been forced through the brutality of the British people to debate on behalf of a London university, and I hope you won't hold that against me. Ladies and gentlemen, if we look to the last speaker's speech, and I thought it was very key that he was offered 2 points of information by our B team. Okay, and he was offered 2 points of information, ladies and gentlemen, which he decided in his own mind he could brush aside and not bother answering. And we say on this side of the House that that isn't good enough. Because what he is fundamentally missing, ladies and gentlemen, is the reason that handing money to women in South Korea won't remove the glass ceiling in Japan is because Japanese women don't agree with the proposal to hand money to women in Korea. And there's a reason they don't agree with it. And it isn't because they don't want extra rights for themselves, ladies and gentlemen. The reason they don't agree with it is because they, like the male folk in Japan, don't like seeing Japan trod on by the outside world. No thank you, because it's something ye miss down that side of the House. House is when, ladies and gentlemen, World War II ended, and when the US started imposing their ideals on Japan, and imposing the ideals of democracy, and imposing the ideals of free market, it was the United States decided to retain the emperor within Japan as a token figure, because they didn't believe the Japanese would accept that sort of interference. They didn't believe, ladies and gentlemen, that the Japanese would accept this sort of imposition. And they believed, ladies and gentlemen, it was for the Japanese people themselves to make this transition. And it was for the Japanese people themselves, ladies and gentlemen, to move closer to the rest of the world. No thank you. And we were told by the last speaker, ladies and gentlemen, that an organic apology will never come from Japan. That Japan will never move closer to apologizing for their acts on their own. And I found this kind of strange, because the first proposition team told us, ladies and gentlemen, that in recent times the Japanese have started including talk about the Pacific War within their history textbooks. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we don't believe that you can just rapidly overhaul the history of a country overnight. What we believe is this organic process of Japan deciding that they have made mistakes and that they have done things wrong is the best way to do this. Because it is the only way, ladies and gentlemen, that Japanese society will accept it. And I'll take you on that.
So if that organic process takes another 50 or 60 or 100 years, you're quite happy to let the plight of women in Japan just continue on until everyone involved is dead?
You see, this is the thing, ladies and gentlemen. They tried to fudge this debate by talking about women in Japan, whereas the proposal doesn't benefit women in Japan at all, ladies and gentlemen. It benefits women in South Korea, and it benefits women who suffered as a result of this. If you're giving away the money, ladies and gentlemen, to other countries, the money is no longer there to benefit the women within Japan. Take a seat, especially if you're giving away half of your GDP, sir, which is quite a lot of money for a country like Japan. And if we look, ladies and gentlemen, at what that side has proposed, and this was the point that Paul made when he stood up and when he offered it, was that when you have a situation, ladies and gentlemen, where there is equality within a system, why do you divide that system by benefiting some women and not benefiting all women? How does your case, ladies and gentlemen, no thank you, in any way prove that these women are more deserving of this money than Japanese women in the status quo? And it's something you failed to prove in your 4 speeches, so I'm not going to take you on it now. Take a seat. And then, ladies and gentlemen, we had a very strange thing come out in the second proposition speech, or the second proposition team first speaker speech, excuse me, when she stood up and she said, we're actually not forcing Japan to give away this money. What we're going to do is we're going to have a test case. And I always thought a case, ladies and gentlemen, ended up with you forcing people to do something. And the reason, ladies and gentlemen, she didn't want you to force them to do it is because she thought, like we do, that the Japanese people should come around to this decision on their own. And we believe that's a fundamental misunderstanding or contradiction, ladies and gentlemen, of the first proposition case. Because the first proposition case quite clearly stood up here and told us that we should force people to force the Japanese government to give away this money. Again, ladies and gentlemen, no thank you. We saw from the last speaker on the proposition a complete unwillingness to deal with the consequences politically within Japan and economically within the region. If you look, ladies and gentlemen, at the rise of the Asian tiger economies, and you look, ladies and gentlemen, at how Japan was integrally involved in the rise of these economies, and how the strength of Japan's economy was very important in the rise of these economies, the last thing you want to do, ladies and gentlemen, is isolate Japan from these countries politically and give Japan the impression that it is forcefully being isolated from these countries. Yes, madam.
Sir, the payment to the women who were sex slaves in World War II is a statement that Japan is rejecting the misogyny which is inherent in the current regime. And secondly, it's not aid for those who need it, it's compensation for wrongs suffered.
No, it's not, ladies and gentlemen. That's the last thing it is. What it is showing people that the Japanese still don't care about what happened during World War II, but are being forced into that position. Because that, ladies and gentlemen, doesn't help bringing nations together. What helps bringing nations together is when the Japanese themselves realize that they have done something wrong, and when the Japanese are freely, ladies and gentlemen, take a seat, willing to admit that they have done something wrong. And that's the misunderstanding on their side of the house. The disharmony will continue to exist, ladies and gentlemen, if the people receiving this money don't believe the Japanese think what they're doing is for the correct reasons. No thank you. If you get money off someone, basically, as James said, it's like as if you're being paid off, ladies and gentlemen. They still don't believe, no thank you, take a seat, because you said it. They still don't believe, ladies and gentlemen, that what they did was wrong. They still don't believe, ladies and gentlemen, that their actions in the past were wrong. And so if they just give you money, that doesn't really help the situation. If they give you an empty apology, ladies and gentlemen, take a seat, that doesn't help the situation. It doesn't bring these communities any closer together to force Japan into this position. If anything, ladies and gentlemen, it creates the resentment which we spoke about within our speeches. Throughout the debate, ladies and gentlemen, they've ignored the issue of the far right within Japan. They've ignored the issue of the rise of the hawks and the rise of the group of people, ladies and gentlemen, who want Japan to retain its military status within the world, who want Japan, ladies and gentlemen, to rise to the same military power it had in the past. And what they missed, and I offered it to the first speaker in a point of information, was the fact that all you do by forcing Japan into a position, and by the world ganging up on Japan in this regard, is give ammunition to these far-right groups. You give them the ability, ladies and gentlemen, to increase their strength. And it isn't good enough to stand up here and say, just because there's a couple of far-right loonies out there, we should do something. What it means is, ladies and gentlemen, when you have a population which is so divided on this issue, you have to make sure you go through it slowly until everybody understands what they did was wrong. You can't force, ladies and gentlemen, Japan into this position, because it doesn't heal the wounds of the past. It doesn't create a situation, ladies and gentlemen, which the people being apologized to actually believe that apology. And that's what's important in this regard. What's important in this regard, ladies and gentlemen, is that when this apology comes, it comes for the right reasons. It's what they ignored, ladies and gentlemen, and it's on these grounds I beg to oppose. Thank you.
Well, that concludes the first and formal part of this debate. The adjudicators will now retire under their convener, Duncan Hamilton, MSP. Duncan Hamilton, not only the youngest member of this House, but also himself a former world's champion. And as the adjudicators are considering their verdict, we could perhaps clear the chamber as quickly as possible, those leaving. We move to open debate. Speeches for and against the motion. I'll allow up to 4 minutes. That's 3 minutes plus interventions in each case. And I would ask speakers to identify themselves by name and by their institution. Firstly, therefore, can I see those who wish to speak in support of the motion? It must have been, yes, here we're off. Gentlemen in the center section, back row.
Ladies and gentlemen, members of this House, my name is Jeremy Tan. I'm from Monash University. I'd like to speak I'd like to speak on behalf of this motion because I believe that there are problems that are inherent in the Japanese system and an inherent misogyny within the Japanese community. And when you have a situation where, ladies and gentlemen, you can buy used undergarments of high school teenagers, female high school teenagers, in vending machines in Tokyo, I think it goes a long way to saying what the situation is in Japan and the way they tend to treat their women, ladies and gentlemen. What we need in this case is to actually see Japan acknowledging the status of women rather than continuing to treat them and objectifying such as they have done in the past and as they are continuing to do in the moment. This is why it is so absolutely vital that Japan recognise and actually start to make reparations for some of the ills that have happened in the past.
Thank you. Can I see those who would wish to speak against the motion, please? Yes, gentleman here, centre left, second row. Yes, you're off.
All right. My name is David Iverson from Regis University in Denver, Colorado. And I think one of the fundamental points that we've missed throughout the debate is one of the first statements made by the members of the proposition that these are tragic and vile crimes. But my question is, what makes them so tragic and vile? Well, it's because the crimes themselves attack the very core of what we universally consider that makes us human. I mean, it attacks the very meaning of being human. And I think that I find it repulsive that we would offer money to make up for such heinous crimes. I mean, my question is, can we offer money to Native Americans in the United States for 250 years of genocide? No, I don't think that we possibly can. Can we offer money to Japanese Americans that were imprisoned during World War II and expect everything to be okay? I don't think that that's possible, and I don't think it's right, and I don't think it solves the problem. Rather, what I think it does is has two fundamental effects. First of all, it allows you to place a dollar sign or a pound sign on human life. But secondly, I think it delegitimizes the sanctity of the person, or delegitimizes the importance of being a person. But also, I think it minimizes the atrocity by saying that we're going to give you a little bit of cash and you're going to be okay. And I find that idea repulsive. So in other words, what we're doing is throwing money at a problem that wasn't caused by money. Rather, it was caused by inhumanity, it was caused by cruelty, and I don't think we should ever try to offer money to fix those kinds of wrongs. Rather, we should apologize, say it's wrong, and try not to do it ever again. But we should never try to offer money to try to fix such a problem. Thank you.
I remind you that interventions are not only possible, but desirable. Speeches for the motion. Yes. Far left, third row.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My name is Aidan Johnson from Harthouse B in the Great University of Toronto, and I actually wasn't planning on making a speech until the address from the Honourable Member from Regis College, who suggested, well, the United States never really could make amends to Aboriginal Americans. The United States never really could make amends to Japanese Americans who were impacted by anti-Japanese policies of the United States during World War II. I'm disinclined to agree, principally on the second point, because of the Canadian experience. It's a very little known fact that Canada had an impact in the Holocaust and World War II in two fundamental ways, both in turning away Jewish immigrants who wished to enter Canada and seek refuge, and lesser known in the international community, imprisoning Japanese Canadians, putting them in concentration camps essentially, where they were denied schooling, jobs, their resources and bank accounts were taken away from them, and all sorts of atrocities, quite similar to what happened in the United States, happened to them. Over the past 20 years, the Canadian government has made amends. We have done our very best to find the families of those who suffered, to reestablish their financial security, to make some sort of recompense for what happened to them. And you know it doesn't erase the crimes of the past. No, the money doesn't always land in the hands of those who actually suffered. But it is atoning. It does raise awareness within the nation of the crimes that were committed in the past. And although Canada is obviously a very different nation from Japan, the same principles apply. And for that reason, I can only support the proposition.
Yes, far right, fourth row.
Okay. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen of this House. My concern focuses on what is the best interest of the women of Southeast Asia. Excuse me. My name is Ron Davidson, and I'm speaking from the National University of Singapore. And I agree with the proposition that these women are entitled to this right, and they are entitled to some compensation. But I believe that with this entitlement comes the choice, and that these women should have the choice of whether or not they want to keep it for themselves, whether or not they want to keep their identity secret, or whether or not they want to